Hello again, my name is Alister McGrath and I'm a British intellectual with a particular interest in the life and writings of C.S. Lewis. And it's my pleasure to bring you this third of this short series of informal presentations on aspects of Lewis's thought, which I hope you'll find interesting and helpful. Now you'll remember that in the previous presentation we looked at some aspects of Lewis's conversion, initially to believing in God and then to Christianity. We focused on Lewis's growing realization that Christianity provided a superb viewpoint from which to look at reality. It was like a lens that brought things into focus. But there's another aspect that I want to look at in this presentation. When did Lewis's conversion actually take place? As many of you will know, in his celebrated autobiography, Surprised by Joy, published in 1955, Lewis tells us about his dramatic conversion in which he became, in his own words, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. And Lewis dates this development to Trinity term 1929, in other words, to Oxford University's summer term, consisting of the 8 weeks from the 28th of April to the 22nd of June 1929. And this date has become a landmark in Lewis studies. It's often regarded as one of the few fixed dates in Lewis's spiritual development that we know with any precision. But I need to suggest to you that Lewis often gets his dates wrong in Surprised by Joy. For example, consider the opening sentence of its 4th chapter. In January 1911, just turned 13, I set out with my brother to Wyvern. Wyvern, remember, was the name that Lewis used to refer to Malvern, an English spa town in which he went to school. But Lewis was 12, not 13, in January 1911. He's a year out at that point. Or consider his memory of buying a copy of George MacDonald's novel Phantastes, a work that made a deep impression on Lewis. In Surprised by Joy, Lewis dates this to October 1915. But we know from a letter to his close friend Arthur Greaves, he actually bought the book in March 1916. Again, he's way out. So given these flawed recollections of dates from his past, why should we trust Lewis when he tells us that he began to believe in God again in Trinity term 1929? Dates aren't Lewis's strong point. I came to appreciate the importance of this when researching my biography of C.S. Lewis. I decided to do the job properly and I spent 15 months reading everything Lewis had published in chronological order, including the vast collection of letters recently edited by Walter Hooper. I thought this detailed engagement with primary sources would help me understand the flow and development of Lewis's ideas and his writing style, and also to allow me to find some good quotes to include in the text. But after a few months I began to realize something was wrong. As I read Lewis's writings from 1929, I sensed no change in his voice or tone. If Lewis did indeed come to believe in God in a Trinity term of 1929, it seems to have made no difference to his outlook or thought. If Lewis was converted in 1929, then that made no impact on his writings, including his letters to his closest friends at that time, Owen Barfield and Arthur Greaves. But his writings of 1930 tell a very different story. Now, Lewis doesn't help us here. He doesn't tell us anything about the external landmarks by which his subjective memory of believing in God can be related to events in the world around him. I want to emphasize there are no reasonable grounds for doubting Lewis's vivid memory of giving in and admitting that God was God. But there are good reasons for questioning the date that Lewis assigns to this. First of all, Lewis's widowed father, Albert Lewis, died in September 1929. Now, if Lewis's chronology of his own conversion is right, Lewis would have come to believe in God at the time of his father's death. But Lewis's correspondence makes no reference to believing in God at all. It has no impact on his final days spent with his father's funeral, or its emotional aftermath. I have to tell you, if Lewis did come to believe in God as a living personal reality in Trinity Term 1929, then that faith made no impact on him at a time when it would have been expected to be important for him. For example, as a consolation at the time of his father's death, especially given that his father shared that faith. So I began to wonder, might the death of Lewis's father have been a stimulus to him to think about God, rather than being something he interpreted in the light of an existing faith in God? If Lewis discovered God in the summer of 1930, his father's death might have marked a turning point in his thinking. After all, there are lots of important scholarly studies that suggest that a parent's death marks a transition in their children's spiritual development. Secondly, Lewis's account of the dynamics of his conversion in Surprised by Joy speak about God closing in on him, taking the initiative and ultimately overwhelming him. There's no hint of such an experience in Lewis's letters of 1929. But there are clear echoes of this language and imagery that Lewis wrote in some haste to his close friend Owen Barfield on the 3rd of February 1930. Lewis talks about the Spirit becoming more personal, taking the offensive, behaving just like God, and Lewis asked Barfield to come and see him soon, otherwise he might end up going into a monastery. Now there's no doubt about the date on which the letter was written, February 1930. And Barfield himself had no doubts about the importance of this letter for Lewis's spiritual development. In an interview given towards the end of his life, Barfield declared this letter marked the beginning of Lewis's conversion. But it's obvious that this conversion lies ahead of Lewis, not behind him. Thirdly, Lewis makes it clear his behaviour changed as a result of believing in God. Although he still wasn't committed to Christianity, he began to attend his local parish church, Holy Trinity, in Quarry, Oxford on Sundays, and Magdalen College Chapel on weekdays. Yet Lewis's letters make no reference to regular attendance at any Oxford church or at Magdalen College Chapel in 1929 or the first half of 1930. Yet things changed decisively in October 1930. In a short letter to Arthur Greaves, remember Greaves was Lewis's closest friend and confidant, Lewis talks about going to bed earlier than he used to, as he's now started going to morning chapel at 8. Again, the letter's dated the 29th of October 1930, and this practice of attending Magdalen College Chapel is presented as a new development, a significant change in his routine, which dates from the beginning of the academic year 1930 to 1931. Now, if Lewis's own dating for his conversion was right, he ought to have started attending chapel a year earlier, but he didn't. Yet this development makes perfect sense if Lewis discovered God in the summer of 1930, perhaps in June 1930, at the end of the academic year, because that will explain why Lewis began to attend college chapel in October 1930, because the college shut down between June and October, and chapel resumed in October. That would have been the first available occasion for Lewis to begin attending college chapel regularly. Now, a traditional date of Lewis's conversion, based on his own narrative in Surprised by Joy, and repeated in every major study of Lewis to date, clearly needs review. If Lewis was converted during any Trinity term, it was Trinity term 1930, not 1929. And in my view, the best date to propose is June 1930. So how could Lewis misremember such an important date in his life? Well, the key point is simply this. Lewis is very good at remembering his subjective memories, but not the objective world of days, months, and years. Lewis himself remarked on this failing in 1957. He wrote he could never remember dates. His older brother, Warney, agreed with that failing, but didn't see it as a recent development. Lewis, he declared, had a lifelong inability to keep track of dates. So maybe Lewis began to believe in God again in 1930, not 1929. But what about his move to Christianity? Remember, Lewis moved in a stage-like process. Atheism, belief in God, Christianity. When did his move to Christianity take place? In Surprised by Joy, Lewis tells us that the final pieces of the jigsaw fell into place on a journey to Whipsnade Zoo. And many believe Lewis is here referring to a trip made to Whipsnade on the 28th of September 1931, when his brother Warney drove him there in the sidecar of his motorbike. But Lewis's narrative in Surprised by Joy simply tells us that things fell into place when he was driven to Whipsnade Zoo. He doesn't say when, he doesn't say who drove him, or in what kind of vehicle he travelled. Now that's important, because there was a second journey to Whipsnade, made 9 months later in June 1932, when Lewis was driven there in a car by one of his friends. Now, Lewis's recollections of this key event in Surprised by Joy are linked with a memory of carpets of bluebells beneath his feet. For those of you who don't know what bluebells look like, you might enjoy these photographs. These are bluebells growing in Pinsey Wood, near where I live in Oxfordshire. And as you can see, they are a striking sight when they bloom. The air is filled with their fragrance, and the ground seems to be like a blue sea of colour. But here's the point. The bluebell blooms from late April into late May or early June. Its leaves wither and disappear by the late summer. And the simple fact is there would have been no bluebells underfoot at Whipsnade Zoo in late September. And Lewis's recollection of bluebells at Whipsnade Zoo is clearly a memory of an early summer day. And that points to the trip in June 1932, not September 1931, for his transition to Christianity. So what's going on here? Has Lewis confused these two visits to Whipsnade? Well, we don't know. And anyway, the simple reality is that dates probably didn't matter all that much to Lewis. For Lewis, what was really important was that God encountered him in the world of time and space and experience, not the precise moment at which this actually happened. In the end, the precise date of Lewis's conversion doesn't really matter. It didn't matter to him. It probably shouldn't matter to anyone else either. If you're a Lewis scholar like me, then maybe it does matter. But if you're mainly interested in enjoying Lewis's writings, it's not that important. His best works date from the 1940s and beyond, and that's long after his conversion. Now, in our next presentation, we're going to look at how Lewis brings together an appeal to reason and imagination in his apologetics. It's one of his most interesting and winsome characteristics, and we're going to explore this in some detail. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to speaking to you again very soon.